This is the Fender Hot Rod Deville. This is my personal amp, and I've used it a whole bunch, and recently I've noticed that the power level has gone down a little bit, so I want to change the tubes. This is very common for people to call us with this particular amp and ask, how do you bias this amp? Well, today I'm going to show you how to do it. This is a great amp, and it's pretty easy to set the bias on. Fender has provided a test point in the back so that you can set your own bias if you have a good multimeter. The first thing you need is an electric screwdriver. I encourage electric screwdriver because there's several screws to remove to get the back panel off. The second thing you'll need is a good multimeter so that you can put on the test point. But before we get started, a safety review. All tube amplifiers contain lethal voltages, often several hundred volts, which will leave burnt entrance and exit wounds in skin. In addition to burnt skin, these voltages can also cause permanent physical damage and death. Not only are these voltages present when the amp is turned on, but also for some time after the amp has been turned off. We want to stress that every piece of electronic equipment must be treated with respect. Okay, the first thing we got to do is take off the back. Once the back has been removed, you'll see the inside of the amp. Now, again, these are high voltage amps. They will store voltage, so it's important that you don't touch anything without first discharging the amp. What I'm going to do first is, when looking at this amp, before you change the power tubes, make sure that you go through and visually check right where these sockets are. Because oftentimes, because of these amps and the way they're mounted to the circuit board, they'll break their connection right there where those tube sockets are, because the tubes are getting hot and they just, the solder just breaks. So I'm going to visually inspect each one of these positions. And I'm going to use my... I'm going to visually inspect each one of these positions. I'm going to use an orange wood stick to lift the wires and move them out of the way so that I can see each one of the connections very closely. Additionally, I'll usually rotate the tube just a little bit to verify that the pins aren't moving at those points where they are soldered on the board. This is very important because oftentimes people will change the tubes thinking the tubes are bad, and it's not necessarily the problem with the tube. The amp has got a bad solder connection, needs to be touched up, and if you put new tubes in it, the new tubes may just be burned up. Okay, I've checked the amp, and they all look like good connections. The next step is to remove the power tubes. You're going to have to push at the little tube retaining clips and slowly rotate the tube out and pulling down. Again, I'm not trying to touch that circuit board. Now I want to put the new tubes in. Again, I want to press those up so it'll slide in nice. Okay. Once I have the new tubes installed, I'm going to plug the amp in. At this point, I'm going to turn the amp on, and I'm going to prepare for measuring it. The amp is on, but it's on standby. The amp is on standby. I'm going to take my multimeter lead, the black lead, and I'm going to put it in one of these screw holes. That's connecting to the chassis. I'm going to turn my multimeter on volt setting, and you'll notice up here the pot for setting the bias is right there. It's a negative 53 volts. Now I'm on the edge of this pot right over here next to this resistor. You'll see the lead right there. I'm going to lay it in there, and I'm going to turn this pot to where it is maximum voltage, so as high as it'll go. I'm going to turn this up until I get the most negative voltage. In this case, it's negative 63 volts. Okay, before we turn it off as standby, we want to make sure that we turn all our volumes down. Once we've done that, I'll take it off as standby. I know that Fender likes to set the amps for 60 millivolts at that test point. That's for 30 millivolts per tube because both tubes are biased at the same time, which is, it requires that you have a match set so that you can, because you can't measure the bias for each individual tube. So I want to take my multimeter lead, I want to put it at my test point, and then with my other hand I'm going to change that bias voltage, and I'm going to look at watch my multimeter, and I'm going to bias it until it reaches 60 millivolts. Now what I normally do right here is after I bias it to 60 millivolts, I'll leave it sit for a little bit because it's going to change as the amp has a tendency just to get warm, everything gets hot. And I'll come back and check it again in about 20 minutes. Alright, it's been about 20 minutes. Now I'm going to check the voltage and see what it's sitting at. 61 or so. I want to bring it back down to 60. So if you wanted to run the tube hotter, you can go up to about 80, not anything over 80, I wouldn't recommend it. That's a good level, safe level. Even though Fender has said 60, excuse me, has said 60, you can run a little hotter if you want a little more dynamics out of the amp and want it to break up a little faster. If you want the tube life to last longer, keep it at 60. I usually keep mine at 60 because it's a safe level. Especially if I'm playing live, I don't want the amp to have an issue, blow a tube while I'm playing at full volume. Okay, so now that we've got it biased, we got to make sure we test it and see how well it sounds.